Acts chapter 27, lesson 23, the life of Paul. One more lesson after this, and the life of Paul is over. And then, yeah. And then, no, he's eternal now. So, but then we will be moving into systematic theology. Sounds cool. It's just basic Bible doctrine. However, we're going to be mixing in a truckload of apologetics as we go along, because you need to be able to defend your faith. And so, how best to defend your faith then? Understand biblical doctrine and how to argue that. So, that's what we're going to do next, because it's also a first-year class. So, we got to get those classes done.
So we should never have to apologize for apologetics.
Exactly. But I see that. Acts chapter 27, and we're going to do the whole chapter tonight. Leave chapter 28 for next week. But Acts chapter 27, starting in verse 1. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus's band. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. And when he had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea to Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. Man, I do not want to have to read those 5 verses again anytime soon. Thank you, Lord, so much for this time to study your word. Just pray that you'd lead us and guide us through this study in Christ's name. Amen. So, I got to start off with, because Acts 27 has a special place in my heart, special meaning. I heard this chapter preached on the Sunday before I got saved. And so I got to tell you this story. Some of you probably heard it before, but Carla, of course, was saved for 8+ years before I got saved. And she went to an independent Baptist church with an old school Baptist preacher who loved to scream at you, spit at you, make you feel awful about yourself, and he loved to slam his fist down on the lectern while he was doing all that. And I didn't want no part of him or her church. She loved going to that church, but I couldn't figure out why. So anyway, there was this church nearby where we lived, the local mega church, that I figured would be easier to digest, because I wasn't saved, but God had been working on me for several months, and it was just like, I need to check out a different church because I don't like her church. And so I asked her, to her complete and total amazement, if she would be willing to check out the local megachurch. And I'm intentionally not naming this church because it still exists and it's still exactly the same, if not worse. But anyway, I asked her if she would go, and she's like, yeah, you want to go to church, as long as, they're actually somewhat teaching the Bible, I'll go. And so, we went, and we show up at the church. They had an awesome coffee bar right when you walk through the door. Big, huge coffee bar when you go through the door, and you could order all the Frappy Lappy, whipped cream, sprinkles, all that stuff. And then you walk into, I won't call it a sanctuary, the auditorium that had movie theater seats that you could recline in with the jumbo cup holder in the armrest. I mean, they were literally movie theater seats in this thing, and they were very comfortable. I don't know how people stayed awake. But you go in there, music blaring. I don't know how anybody could hear anything anybody was saying, even if you're standing right next to them. But there was electric guitars, 2 drum sets up on the stage. It wasn't a pulpit, it was a stage. And they were just rocking out. And I'm just like, wow, okay. And so we go there, and we're sitting there, and after the band plays for about 20 minutes, my ears are bleeding, and then this hippie surfer kid comes walking out on the stage. He's literally wearing board shorts, a tank top, and flip-flops. Now, we live in the desert, or we lived in the desert, the high desert of Southern California. So, I mean, there is coastline where you can surf, but, I mean, he wasn't nowhere near close enough to it to be wearing what he was wearing. But anyway, he comes out, and he's like, yo, dude, kind of thing. I found out later he was the youth pastor, so that made more sense, I guess. But so he introduces the senior pastor of the church and does announcements and things like that. And the senior pastor comes out, and I mean, he was actually had slacks and a polo shirt on, and I mean, he was wearing those weird, like brown leather sandal things that guys wear with no socks, which, you know, to me is weird, but, you know, to each his own. That's okay. But he, you know, he looked okay. And he comes out, and he is preaching a message out of Acts chapter 27, because he is talking about Paul's journey as a prisoner to Rome. And as you'll see tonight, they're hitting several different ports. And tonight and next Sunday, they go to several different ports on the way to Rome. And they had 2 huge, these are tiny compared to the huge monitors. They had 2 of them, one on either side of the stage. And so they had on the monitors maps showing the route that Paul was taking on this journey. And so, like, he started talking, he says, okay, they start in Cyprus and they travel to Myra. And so then this little boat on the map starts going across the ocean. And while it's doing that, they're playing the theme to Gilligan's Island.
Then Roy shows up.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking to myself, and keep in mind, I am completely unchurched. I did not grow up in a Christian home. I did not grow up going to church. And I'm thinking to myself, this is weird. I mean, this is just the weirdest thing ever to me. And so the whole time, every time Paul would go from one port to the next one, here goes the little ship on the map, playing the theme music of Gilligan's Island. Every single port they went to, from port to port, playing the theme music to Gilligan's Island. So we're walking out of the church after the thing that they did there. And Carla is just kind of feeling me out with this, what just happened kind of thing. And she goes, "What did you think of that service?" And I'm like, "That was weird." And I hated the band because I couldn't understand a word they said. All I could hear was drums beating as hard as they could be beat and guitars riffs ripping, and I couldn't understand anything anyone was saying. And I said, "What did you think?" She goes, "Oh, thank goodness that's what you thought." But then I said, "Well, I know they have a traditional service here. Would you mind trying that next week?" Because I'm still not sold on her church by any stretch of the imagination. And which I ended up becoming the youth pastor at that church eventually. But her church. Yeah. And so she goes, "Yeah, I guess we could." Well, what had happened on Wednesday when she shows up at church, because she was and had been very involved in the church and worked as a nursery worker, and I mean, she's just involved in everything. And the pastor's wife comes up to her and goes, "We missed you on Sunday. Where were you at?" And this is why if somebody doesn't show up to Sunday church, you need to ask them the next Sunday when they show up, "Where were you at?" Kind of like they did when you walked in tonight, Bud. Said, "Bud, where were you at today?" And she goes, "Well, Randy asked me to go to the weird mega church across town, and so we went." And she's like, "Oh my goodness." And she goes, "Well, how'd that go?" And she goes, "He hated it. But he wants to try their traditional service next week." And she's like, "Okay, well, I know that the pastor's wife immediately went and told him what Carla said, because before Carla left that night, the pastor talked to her and said, 'Hey, you mind if we come by your house? Mind if we come by your house on Saturday morning?' And she's like, 'What time, exactly, will you be there?' He said 10:30. She goes, 'Yes, okay, perfect.' And she was smart enough to know not to tell me, because she knew I would leave. And so that Saturday, her pastor, and later on I found out who the guy was. He was the church treasurer. But they show up at the door 10:30. Carla, washing dishes. She's like, "Can you answer that? I'm washing dishes." "Sure." And so go answer the door, saw who it was. I'm like, "All right, let's do it." So there you go. So this, Acts 27, has a little special place for me because of the whole weird Gilligan's Island thing at the megachurch in the town that we used to live in that actually drove me to a decent Bible preaching, teaching church.
You still hear Gilligan's Island?
Yeah, my skin crawls now if I see it on MeTV or something and they're playing the theme music. I'm just like, oh my gosh. But it's funny what God will use to draw you to Him. Yeah, okay, stop it. So first, we're going to look at tonight, Paul's journey to Rome begins from Cyprus to Myra. Paul's journey to Rome begins from Cyprus to Myra. Now, I'm going to read verse 1 again, probably without all the names. No, I'll read them. "And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus's band." What's the first thing that we should pick up on in verse number 1? I've hammered this thing, and hammered this thing, and hammered this thing.
That Luke was with him.
There you go. Personal pronoun. So whenever you're reading the book of Acts, because Luke is the author of the book of Acts, watch to see what personal pronouns were used. Is Luke saying they and them, or we and us, kind of thing? And that way you can tell whether or not Luke is actually with Paul. And the reason why this is interesting is Paul is a prisoner, and he's being taken like in bonds. I mean, you know, he's being taken as a prisoner to Rome, and he's got people hanging out, traveling with him. So you got that going for him, which is nice. The man responsible for getting Paul to Rome was a soldier named Julius. We just read that. He was the captain. It says Julius was a centurion of Augustus's band. So who is Augustus?
Nero.
Yeah, the Caesar, Nero. Yeah, Nero is the one he's the Caesar at the time. And so this guy's a pretty high level soldier. How many men does he have under him?
100.
Well, how do you know that?
Centurion.
There you go. Okay, so you see all the stuff. If you're paying attention when you're reading, you can pick up on a whole lot of things that a lot of times we just kind of gloss over when we're reading. We're just reading words. We're really not paying attention to them. But you can pick up on a whole lot of stuff if we really, when we're reading for comprehension, not just to get past the words that we're looking at. So always read for comprehension. By the way, the Greek word used for centurion actually literally means captain over 100 men. So then in verse 2, they boarded a ship headed to the port city of Adramyttium, which of course is in Asia Minor. How can you not know that? We know that Luke and Aristarchus are traveling with him, because Luke is using personal pronouns, including himself. And then Aristarchus, in verse 2, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. So Luke has at least 2 men that he knows that are traveling with him from, where were they at? From Cyprus, duh. All right, so Aristarchus was also, by the way, in Ephesus when the riot broke out in Ephesus. You know, the Asian Jews that were running around causing all the problems, they were part of the riot that broke out in Ephesus. And Acts 19 verse 29 tells us that Aristarchus was one of the guys that was there during that riot. The first stop for this leg of the journey was in a place called Sidon, 70 miles north of Caesarea. And then verse 3 says, "And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself." So he let him debark from the ship and go out and hang out with some buddies at the port. And so obviously Julius wasn't too concerned about Paul running away, escaping, anything like that. Obviously, Paul had impressed on Julius something that led him to believe this, so he wasn't too concerned about that. Then in verse 4 it says, "And when we had launched from thence," so when they leave Sidon, it says, "we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary." So the Bible is full of details that you wouldn't really find in other books. You know, if somebody's just writing a story, you typically don't find details like this out. Verse 4 points out that they were literally forced to sail along the coastline You couldn't go out into open ocean. They were forced to sail along the coastline of Cyprus because it shielded them from the strong winds that were in that area. They're in the Mediterranean Sea, by the way. I think we covered this last week, but this trip is taking place in the Mediterranean Sea. And we're going to get into this here in a second about how dangerous the Mediterranean Sea was this particular time of the year, because we know pretty much exactly when this all took place, based on just going back in time and the amount of information we have on what's going on there. Then number 2, Roman numeral 2, the trip continued from Myra to Crete. The trip continued from Myra to Crete, starting in verse 6, and there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And when he had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmone, and hardly passing it came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lace. Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. And so they had arrived at Myra, we saw in verse 5, and they are going to make preparations to sail to Crete. In verse 6, we're told they board a ship going from Alexandria, which is where? Egypt. Yeah. From Alexandria to Italy. And this was a grain ship that was carrying wheat. Now, do you remember me reading that? Of course not, because I didn't read it yet. Verse 38 tells us that. It says, when they had eaten enough, they lighted the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. So we'll get to that part here in a minute. But so this was a grain ship, and the reason why it came out of Alexandria is Egypt was basically supplying the vast majority of the known world at the time with grain. Not a lot had changed since Joseph's time. Think back to what took place when the big famine hit, and Joseph's family, Jacob and all of his brothers, came down to Egypt. You know, Joseph was the number 2 dude in Egypt during that time, and he was the one that explained Pharaoh's dream to him and told him that a famine was coming for 7 years, but first they're going to have 7 years of bountiful harvest, and you need to save back 20% of that harvest to cover what's going to take place in the famine. And he did that, and so here we are, fast forward clear into the book of Acts, and Egypt is still doing the same thing. They are still the grain capital of the known world at that time, and so that's what that ship was doing. It was carrying a load of grain to Rome. Let's see, the ship had 276 people. That includes crew and passengers. I also did not read that part to you. We find that out in verse 37. And we were all in the ship, 216 souls. And so 276 people were on board that ship, crew and passengers. Verse 8 tells us, it says, and hardly passing it came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto the city of Lace. And so verse 8 tells us They arrived at a harbor called Fair Havens, which means good shelter, and that was on the island of Crete. Verse 9 says, "Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them." And again, we're going to find out a whole bunch of stuff here just because Paul mentions that they were fasting. And knowing what time of year it was, because of the weather that was taking place in the Mediterranean Sea at the time, that actually narrows down to exactly what fast they were fasting over. And so verse 9, sailing in the Mediterranean from mid-September to the first part of November was dangerous because during that time of the year, there are always violent storms in the Mediterranean. And so there was some concern as they started this journey. And again, I read this in verses 11 and 12 already, but they did not want to harbor in a certain area because it wasn't, they used the word commodious. It was, and it's not referring to commodes, they had bathrooms there. But it just wasn't a place where a bunch of Roman soldiers that are on leave for the winter would want to hang out at. So if you've been in the military, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't want to hang out in Wisconsin. You would rather hang out in Florida, right? So just using that as an example. There's just certain places you don't want to hang out in because they're boring. But anyway, dangerous, violent storms during that time. The fast that is being referred to because of that time of year is referring to the Day of Atonement, which what do they call the Day of Atonement now? You know, modern times. That's the one, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. Now, do you know what happens on the Day of Atonement or on Yom Kippur? Because it is the highest holy day in Israel.
Hamas comes across the border and slaughters people.
Well, yeah. Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, is the one time a year that the high priest was allowed by God to enter the Holy of Holies. And the reason why it is referred to as the Day of Atonement is this one time a year the high priest would go in and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies. And so let me dispel this rumor. If you have ever heard a pastor preach this, shame on that pastor, because it's an absolute out and out lie. But there are some preachers that will say that that the high priest would have a rope tied around his ankle in case he went into the Holy of Holies and he did something that made God mad and God struck him dead, they'd be able to drag him out. Because the only person that was allowed in the Holy of Holies was the high priest. It's the only one. So you couldn't go in and get him if he died in there. Now, I am here to tell you that if you look at the book of Leviticus and the Levitical law that dictates how the high priest is supposed to approach the Holy of Holies, how he is supposed to dress, everything about that is so meticulous. If you would add something to that, God would strike him dead on the spot. He wouldn't make it, he wouldn't make it into the Holy of Holies, and he would defile the Holy of Holies by not having enough faith that God was going to, because if there was something wrong with the priest, God would strike him dead before he ever entered. I guarantee it.
I've heard that as well, maybe they added veils
Yeah, yeah, and so there's just, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of,
Put the human element to that whole image.
yeah, there's a lot of isms out there that just are not true. And so if you ever hear a pastor say that, say, you show me the verse in the Bible where it says that.
He
'Cause-
did not go in there without that blood either, right?
Correct. And that was the only purpose for him going in the Holy of Holies, was to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, and then he left. I mean, he didn't hang out in there and, pull up the lounge chair and hang out, hey, how's it going, God? No. This was a very, I don't even know if this is a word, but a very sacramental day. I mean, very sacred day. And a very sacred thing. Again, he was only allowed in there one time a year, and that was it. And that was to give an atonement for the entire nation. And so that was how, because back in the day when they did animal sacrifices to cover their sin, and again, I covered this morning, so I'm not going to go over this again, even though some of you weren't here, you just missed out. But the blood was how sin is covered. And so your sin covered under the blood. Well, all of the animal sacrifices they did, they were only good for 1 year because it was an imperfect sacrifice. And so God would only allow that for 1 year. So once a year, this would actually technically be the beginning of their civil calendar year, around this time of the year. The high priest would go in and he would give this sacrifice and sprinkle the blood, and then that would cover for last year's sin. And then the next year he'd do the same thing, and they just kept doing that year after year after year. And so actually, I got yakking so much. Leviticus 23, because I got to give Sam something to do. Leviticus 23 and verses 27 and 28. Since you got that all fired up for us there, talks about this. It says, also on the 10th day of this 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. It shall be an holy convocation unto you, and ye shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Again, we talked about this in this morning's adult Bible study lesson, because we're talking about Exodus, and we were talking about the Passover this morning. Again, notice the atonement had to be by fire, just like the specific instructions that were given related to the Passover when, during the Exodus, Israel was coming out of Egypt. All of this is the Passover, the Day of Atonement. All of this are types or pictures of the coming Messiah. And so all through the entire Old Testament, the saying is, the Old Testament is Jesus concealed, the New Testament is Jesus revealed. And so you see pictures or types of the coming Messiah and what he will look like, all that will transpire. And so you see that through all of these sacrificial offerings, because ultimately he becomes the perfect sacrifice. And so again, offering made by fire, verse 28, and ye shall do no work in that same day, for it is a day of atonement, to make an atonement for you before the Lord your God. And so that's the Day of Atonement, and that is the fast that they were stopping or breaking here in Acts 27.
Is that one of the 7 days people get their, seventh day of get some of their doctrine from that?
Seventh-day Advent, well, Yeah, Seventh-day Adventists get basically all of their beliefs come from Levitical law, come from the Old Testament, which, again, you know, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because the law, of course, was given to show you that it's impossible to save yourself. And Seventh-day Adventist, and I mean, we had the church we started out in California. We had a Seventh-day Adventist church right next door to us in the same storefront.
They still don't know how good bacon is.
I feel sorry for them.
But you know, I'd sit there on Saturday and I would watch them all pull up in their cars, and I'm thinking, man, how many laws did you just break by doing that? Because Levitical law on the Sabbath day is, so they claim they observe the Sabbath, but Levitical law says you cannot start a fire. If you drive a vehicle that has a gas combustion engine in it, that's creating fire in that engine. You violate that law. Levitical law said on the Sabbath you could not travel more than 1/4 of a mile total in the day. All right? If you're driving to a church, you're definitely violating that law because you're traveling more than 1/4 of a mile. I mean, there's all kinds of laws attached to observing the Sabbath that they violate. So anyway, and then number 3, the third leg of the journey went from Crete to Melita. The third leg of the journey went from Crete to Melita. Starting in verse 13, it said, and so Paul has warned them they shouldn't go. So verse 13, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. So, in verse 13, you're witnessing the calm before the storm. Now, anybody that has sailed this area of the Mediterranean, they know that this time of year is not good for sailing. And keep in mind, they're not cruising on like an aircraft carrier or a big battleship or something. They're in an old rickety wooden boat. And we're going to find out how that they were going to help themselves out because they were in an old rickety wooden boat. So this calm before the storm, they believed falsely that they would have an easy journey. And then you hit verse 14. Immediately after they set sail, they have this massive storm come up against them. So we got to pick apart verse 14 because, again, English language, stupidest language on the planet. It just, the way this is written makes absolutely no sense at all. The English word arose in Greek means violent or intense. So that word doesn't even fit properly in this sentence. So the Greek word that's used means violent or intense, and then the word tempestuous, the Greek word, means stormy. So we have a violent, intense, and stormy weather condition that's taking place in verse 14. And then there's this, actually it's pronounced Euroclydon, not Euroclydon, or it's Euroclydon. This is the only time this word is used in the Bible, and it's of unknown origin. But breaking it down from its two root words, it is most likely referring to this storm is a hurricane. So that fits with, if you use the proper words in verse 14, violent, intense, stormy hurricane is what verse 14 should say, is what's taking place there. It's not just some, when I think that a storm arose, I'm thinking like, okay, so a storm cloud rolls in and you get a little rain, something. That doesn't sound violent and intense to me. But that's the way it should read. A violent, intense, and stormy hurricane hit. They sought temporary shelter at the island of Clauda, we see in verse 16, and running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. Now, here's the much work that they're going to do. The storm was so violent, they decided, and this was very common during this time with these kind of boats, they decide that they're going to basically put ropes over the front of the boat and let them float back. And as they get to a certain point in the boat, then they get the ropes, because they've got a rope on either side of the boat, and they bring it to the center and they tie it together. They lash it together and pull that rope together as tight as they possibly can. That's what's being talked about here. In verse 17 it says, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship. That's what undergirding's talking about. And this was a very common practice used during this time when you had these old wooden boats. They literally, during stormy weather, would wrap ropes around the boat in hopes that the ropes that they tied up are going to hold the boat together while this boat's being bashed about by the waves. And so that's what the undergirding is that's taken place. And fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail and were so driven. And so first they undergird the boat, they get it tightened up with the ropes and all that stuff, and then they decide that they don't want to get shoved into the shoreline and get stuck in a sandbar somewhere. So they decide to raise the sails and just let the wind kind of drive them, which typically in a sailboat, you don't want to be doing that in a hurricane. That's bad plan. And so because of the extreme weather, they decided to lighten the load of the ship. We see in verses 18 and 19. And we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lighted the ship, and the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And so first thing that they did is they start tossing all of the barrels of wheat overboard. That second day or whatever it is, they're in the storm. The third day, they get rid of the tackling. Anybody know what the tackling on a ship is? We don't. Now, see, if Mark was here, he could tell us because he was in the Navy. But the tackling is basically what's used to strap down all the cargo and to hoist all the cargo around on the boat and things like that. And so it's a bunch of ropes and pulleys and levers and all that stuff. So they toss all that overboard because they got rid of all of the ship's cargo. And which, huh?
They didn't need it.
Well, no, they're just trying to survive the storm right now. So they're doing what it is that they could. And then we see that after they do all this, that the crew loses hope. Verse 20, and when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. And so they're getting desperate. And so what does Paul do at their most desperate moment? He says, nanny daddy boo boo, told you so. That is literally what he did in the next verse. He said, "But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and have not loosed from Crete, you big dummies." And that Randy Revised Version, that last part. But Paul starts poking them in the chest, saying, "You should have listened to me." Now, I'm not sure that was the Christian thing to do there, Paul, but anyway, he did it. But then, right after he tells them that, he assures them that they're going to make it through, because he is visited by an angel, and angel of God tells him that you're going to make it through. The angel of God kind of lays it out for him to make sure that Paul understands what they're supposed to do. So Paul tells them, he goes, "We're going to make it through this, but you have to follow God's direction in this. You have to pay attention and do it God's way. Otherwise, you're not going to make it." And so, as we get down a little further there, in verse 27, it says, "But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria," which is the Mediterranean, "about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded, and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again, and found it 15 fathoms." Now, here's a lot of Navy talk, a lot of maritime talk here. What in the world is he talking about when he's talking about sounding? Because by sounding, they have determined that they're getting close to land. Because, they didn't have sonar, so you couldn't press a button and go, boom, and then the sound returns to you, so they didn't have that. This is how they used to do it. Back then, this is how they did it. With a plumb line, basically. You have a big lead weight, and you have a really long rope, and anybody happen, but I'm sure Bud does, happen to know just off the top of your head, how many feet are in a fathom?
What is it, Bud? 120.
350.
No.
350.
6 feet in a fathom. And so,
I was talking about when it was 20,000.
yeah, exactly. So 20 fathoms would be 120 feet. And so, but what they would do is they had this big long rope, and every 6 feet on the rope there was a mark. And so they would just drop that rope down, and they would count off every one until the lead weight hit bottom, and then they'd pull it back up. And so that's how they could determine that their depth was shrinking. So it went from 120 feet, or 20 fathoms, to 15 fathoms in a relatively short period of time, which is
90 feet.
and so 90 feet. So it lost 30 feet pretty quick as they were checking that out, and so they knew that they were approaching land. So what do? They throw the anchors in, because they don't want to destroy the ship, that it's going to get slammed up into the shoreline or maybe stuck in a sandbar or something like that. So they drop anchors, and then, of course, some of the crew members, they're like, "We want off of this boat right now." And Paul tells them, says, "You get in the water, you're going to die." It's Randy Revised Version, but that's what was taking place. He said, "You get on that lifeboat, you're going to die. God said you got to stay on this ship, and we're going to stay on this ship until sunlight, and then we're going to make our move." And so now, since I guess Paul had done his nanny boo-boo to him, said, "I was right and you were wrong," now they're going to listen to Paul. And what they do is the lifeboat that these guys were going to drop into the water, they cut the ropes on them and got them off the ship so that they couldn't abandon ship. And then, so they end up riding out the storm. They wait till the next morning. By the way, from the place where the storm struck to where they landed was 476 miles, and they had been adrift, basically, just letting the storm push them for 14 days. And on day two, they threw all of the food overboard. And so I'm not sure, Paul tells them before they get off the ship, Paul tells them that, let me find this here. Okay, so verse 33, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take food, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. So I'm not sure where they got this food from, but anyway, apparently they were smart enough at least to save maybe 1 barrel of wheat. I don't know, but they got a little food before they got off the boat. And so then they decided to make a bead for the shoreline, and they were trying to run the ship up on the shore. When they did that, they ended up wrecking the ship. And this was, by the way, the 4th shipwreck Paul had been involved in. If you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, when Paul is listing all of the things that have happened to him since he'd become a Christian, in that list was 3 shipwrecks. This makes number 4. And Julius, by the way, if the ship is going down and they are abandoning ship, the Roman soldiers' command was to kill all prisoners. Because if you're a Roman soldier and you're responsible for prisoners and they escape, you die. But you are more than welcome to kill them so that they can escape. But in verse 43 we see, but the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. And so Julius, again, Paul had some kind of bond with Julius, this guy that was taking him back to Rome, because Julius saved not only Paul's life, but saved all the prisoners' life, and just said, we're going to let him go, and we'll deal with it then. Yeah. So, any questions? All right.
I'm not gonna ask any of them.
You got lots of questions, but you're not going to ask them?
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna get started.
Well, see, now everybody wants to know, but that's all right. Lord, thank you so much for this time, and Lord, thank you for this study we've been going through. Man, lesson 23, and we've got one more. And Paul was an amazing evangelist that lived an amazing life. And Lord, I know that he was just a guy. But he was just a guy that allowed himself to be used by you in a great way. And Lord, I just pray for myself and for anyone else. Lord, I pray that we would have the courage and we would have the desire and the burden to be used like Paul. In Christ's name, amen.
Hopefully with less rod beaten and whipping and
Yeah.
shipwrecks.
Oh,
Okay, this happens a lot.
What in the world happened?
I never seen a lot. Get filled up if you move.
Regular board.